The evening air in downtown Atlanta hummed with the usual mix of traffic, distant sirens, and the low chatter of people heading out for dinner. Inside Leclerc, one of the city's most talked-about restaurants, everything moved with quiet precision. Crisp white tablecloths, soft jazz playing just loud enough to be noticed, servers gliding between tables with practiced ease. It was the kind of place where a single meal could cost more than most people made in a week, and the guests knew it. They walked in like they owned the room, and sometimes they acted like they owned the people in it too. Near the back, a young woman wiped down a tray with a clean cloth, her movements quick but careful. She'd been on her feet since noon, and her shift wouldn't end until after midnight. Her feet ached, her lower back throbbed, and her eyes felt dry from blinking too little. But she didn't complain. She couldn't afford to. Every tip, every hour, every polite thank you mattered. She was saving every spare dollar to help her younger brother stay in college. His tuition was due again in a few weeks, and the last payment had nearly emptied her account. She'd worked at Leclerc for almost 2 years. She knew how to read the room. The regulars who liked extra bread, the couples celebrating anniversaries, the business people who barely looked up from their phones. She'd learned to smile even when she was exhausted, to stay calm when someone snapped at her for a delayed order, to swallow her pride when a guest made a comment that stung just a little too much. She wasn't just serving food. She was managing moods, expectations, and egos, all while balancing 3 plates and a tray of drinks. That night, a group of 5 walked in just after 8. They didn't make a reservation, but the hostess seated them immediately anyway. Something about the way they carried themselves, the sharp suits, the confidence that came with never having to worry about a bill. At the center of the group was a man who seemed to command attention without saying a word. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than her car. He didn't look around the restaurant like the others did. He just walked straight to the table, sat down, and pulled out his phone like the world existed only on that screen. She was assigned to their table. As she approached, she introduced herself politely, recited the specials, and took their drink orders without a hitch. But then, halfway through dinner, it happened. The man reached for his wine glass, his hand brushing against the bottle. It tipped slightly, and a stream of deep red wine spilled onto the floor, and right onto his polished leather shoes. He looked down, frowned, and without even glancing up, barked, "You, clean this." She paused. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll get a towel for the floor right away." "No," he cut in, still not looking at her. "My shoes." "Clean them." The words hung in the air like smoke. A few nearby diners glanced over. One woman lowered her fork. The man's friends kept eating, pretending not to notice, but their eyes flickered with discomfort. She stood there for a second, her heart suddenly loud in her chest. She'd been disrespected before. Rude comments, condescending tones, the occasional sweetheart or girl. But this felt different. This wasn't just impatience. It felt like he saw her as something less than human, like she existed only to serve his comfort, even in the most degrading way. She could have walked away. She could have called her manager. But she knew how that usually played out. The guest was always right, especially when they spent thousands in one night. Complaining might mean a warning, or worse, losing her job. And she couldn't risk that. Not now. Still, something inside her refused to kneel. She took a slow breath, the kind you take when you're trying to keep your voice steady, even though your hands want to shake. "Sir," she said, calm but firm, "I'm a server. I'm happy to get you a clean cloth or call housekeeping for your shoes, but I don't clean footwear." For the first time, he looked up. His eyes were cold, sharp, like he wasn't used to being told no. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, voice low but edged with threat. "I don't," she replied evenly. "But it doesn't matter. Everyone here deserves respect, including me." A silence fell over the table. One of his friends cleared his throat awkwardly. The man stared at her for a long moment, then scoffed. "Insolent," he muttered, shaking his head like she'd personally offended him. "I'll be speaking to your manager. You'll be lucky if you still have a job by tomorrow." She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her apron, pulled out a fresh white napkin, and placed it gently on the edge of his table, right next to his wine-stained shoes. "The napkin's complimentary," she said, her voice steady. "Have a pleasant rest of your evening." Then she turned and walked away, her legs trembling slightly but her posture straight. She didn't look back, but she could feel the weight of eyes on her, some sympathetic, some curious, maybe even a few admiring. Back in the kitchen, her hands finally shook. One of the cooks gave her a knowing nod. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, just another Tuesday." But inside she was reeling, not from fear, though that was there, but from something deeper. She'd stood her ground, not with anger, but with quiet dignity. And in that moment, she'd reminded herself of something important. No amount of money, no title, no power gave anyone the right to strip her of her worth. Unbeknownst to her, a young man at a nearby table had quietly recorded the whole exchange on his phone. He hadn't planned to. He'd just been struck by how calmly she'd handled it, how she'd refused to shrink even when the world tried to make her small. He posted the clip online later that night with a simple caption: "When respect costs nothing, but some people still won't pay." By morning, it would have thousands of views. By the next day, millions. But right then, in the quiet hum of the kitchen, she was just a young woman counting down the minutes until her shift ended, hoping she hadn't just thrown away her job and her brother's future over a pair of dirty shoes. What she didn't know yet was that this moment, this small, quiet act of courage was about to change far more than just her night. It was about to ripple outward in ways no one could predict, least of all the man who thought a pair of shoes was more important than a person. The next morning came too soon. She woke up before her alarm, staring at the ceiling, the events of the night before replaying in her head like a stubborn song she couldn't turn off. She kept hearing his voice, cold, sharp, certain, and her own steady despite the fear underneath. She'd slept only a few hours, tossing and turning, wondering if she'd made a huge mistake. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She picked it up, half expecting a message from her manager saying not to come in today, but instead it was her brother. "Hey," he said when she answered, voice still thick with sleep. "You okay? I saw something weird online." "What do you mean?" she asked, sitting up. "Someone posted a video from LeClaire last night." It's you." Her stomach dropped. "What? No, that can't be," but it was. Within minutes, she was scrolling through her feed, heart pounding. There it was, the clip, grainy, shot from a phone, but clear enough. Her voice calm. His demand. Her refusal. The napkin on the table. The caption read, "She didn't clean his shoes. She cleaned his attitude." Comments flooded in, hundreds, then thousands. "Queen, this is why I tip well." Imagine thinking you're better than someone because you have money. Others were angrier. "That man needs to be banned." "Hope she gets a raise, not fired." She felt dizzy. She hadn't wanted attention. She just wanted to do her job without being treated like furniture. Now the whole world was watching. She got dressed slowly, hands shaking as she buttoned her uniform. She didn't know if she still had a job. She didn't know if she'd be welcomed back or handed a pink slip the second she walked through the door. But she had to go. Rent was due. Her brother's books weren't going to buy themselves. When she arrived at LeClaire, the usual morning calm was gone. A small crowd had gathered near the entrance. Reporters with cameras, curious onlookers holding phones. Her manager stood just inside the doorway, arms crossed, face tight with stress. "Don't talk to anyone," he said as soon as she stepped in. "And don't post anything. We're handling this," she nodded, throat dry. "Am I still working today?" He hesitated. "For now. But corporate's watching. And that man?" "He called this morning. Demanded your termination." Her chest tightened. But before she could respond, another server pulled her aside. "Girl, you're all over Twitter," she whispered, eyes wide. "People are calling you a hero." She didn't feel like a hero. She felt exposed, raw, like someone had peeled back her skin and put her nerves on display. Inside, the staff treated her differently. Some avoided her, scared of guilt by association. Others gave her quick, supportive nods. The head chef slipped her a coffee with a quiet, "You did the right thing." She clutched the cup like it was an anchor. Meanwhile, across town, the man from the restaurant sat in his penthouse office, scrolling through the same video on loop. At first, he'd been furious. How dare someone film him? How dare she defy him? But as the hours passed and the outrage grew, something shifted. He saw the comments. He saw how people described him, not as a powerful businessman, but as a bully, a spoiled man who thought money bought him the right to humiliate others. He tried to brush it off. He'd faced criticism before. But this felt different. This wasn't about a failed deal or a bad investment. This was about who he was as a person. And for the first time in years, he didn't like the reflection staring back. Back at the restaurant, lunch service began. She moved through her tables like a ghost. Efficient, quiet, careful not to draw more attention. But eyes followed her. Guests whispered. One older woman stopped her to say, "I'm proud of you." Another left a $100 tip with a note. For standing tall. Still, the fear lingered. Around 2 p.m., her manager called her into the back office. Her heart hammered. She braced for the worst, but instead of firing her, he looked exhausted. "Corporate just called," he said, rubbing his temples. "They're getting bombarded. Customers are canceling reservations. Our social media is on fire. Half the city thinks we're supporting that guy's behavior." He paused. "They want you to stay. In fact, they want you to do an interview." With the local news, she blinked. "Me, why?" "Because," he said, almost smiling, "you're the only good thing in this mess." That afternoon, she sat in a quiet corner of the restaurant with a reporter. She didn't wear makeup. She didn't rehearse fancy words. She just spoke from the heart. "I didn't do anything special," she said softly. "I just asked to be treated like a person. That's all. I work hard, I show up. I try to be kind even when it's hard. And last night, I just couldn't pretend that what he asked was okay." The reporter asked if she was scared. She nodded. "Yeah, I was terrified." But staying silent felt worse. The interview aired that evening. More people saw it. More shared it. Donations started pouring into a GoFundMe someone had set up for her brother's education, without her even knowing. Strangers sent messages. "You gave me courage today. I stood up to my boss because of you." She cried that night, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of being seen. Really seen. Not as a server, not as a black woman in a uniform, but as a human being with dignity, worth, and a voice that mattered. And miles away, in his silent office, the man watched her interview. He saw the quiet strength in her eyes, the lack of bitterness, the simple truth in her words. He thought about his own daughter, about the kind of world he wanted her to grow up in. He thought about all the times he'd used his power to make others feel small, just because he could. For the first time in a long time, he felt ashamed. He didn't call the restaurant again to complain. He didn't threaten lawsuits. Instead, he sat at his desk late into the night, staring at the city lights below, wondering if it was too late to change. What he didn't know yet was that change doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it starts with a single moment of courage, and the quiet decision to respond with humility instead of pride. And that decision was about to set everything in motion. The story didn't fade. If anything, it grew louder. By the third day, it wasn't just local news, it was national. Morning talk shows played the clip. Late-night hosts referenced it in monologues, not to mock, but to praise. "Sometimes," one host said, "the most powerful thing you can do is say no with grace." At first, she tried to ignore it. She kept working her shifts, kept folding napkins, kept taking orders like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Reporters still lingered outside Leclerc, though fewer now. Inside, regulars came just to see her. Some to thank her, others just to watch, like she was a character in a movie they'd stumbled into. She smiled politely, served their meals, and went on with her day. But the weight of being watched, of being talked about, never really left her shoulders. Then came the backlash. Not everyone saw her as brave. Online, some voices turned sharp. "She's making a big deal out of nothing," one comment read. "He just wanted his shoes cleaned. Get over it." Others accused her of staging the whole thing for attention. "Probably planned it with that guy filming," another wrote. "People will do anything for clout." The word stung more than she expected. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't wanted fame or debate. She'd just wanted to keep her head down and do her job without being treated like she was less than. But now strangers were dissecting her tone, her posture, even the way she'd folded that napkin. It felt like her dignity was up for public vote. One evening, after a long shift, she sat on the steps behind the restaurant, phone in hand, scrolling through the comments. Her eyes burned. She wasn't crying, she was too tired for tears, but a deep ache settled in her chest. Was she wrong to expect basic respect? Had she really overreacted? Just then, her phone buzzed with a call from her brother. She answered, voice hoarse. "You seeing this?" He asked, not even saying hello. "Seeing what?" "Your GoFundMe. It's past $30,000, she froze. "What? Who started that?" Some teacher in Chicago says she saw your interview and wanted to help. People are donating from all over. Nurses, truck drivers, students. One guy gave $5 and wrote, "Wish I could give more. Keep your head up." She covered her mouth with her hand. The kindness in that small gesture, the $5, the note, undid something inside her. It wasn't about the money. It was about the message. You're not alone. Meanwhile, across town, the man who demanded she clean his shoes sat in a boardroom that felt colder than usual. His phone kept lighting up. Emails from investors, calls from PR advisors, even a message from his own sister. "Did you really do that? I'm embarrassed for you." His company's stock had dipped. Not dramatically, but enough to raise eyebrows. More troubling was the internal chatter. Employees were talking. Some had posted the video on their private accounts with captions like, "Is this the culture we work in?" Others quietly updated their resumes. He'd always believed success was measured in assets, deals, influence. But now, for the first time, he wondered if character mattered more. He watched her interview again, really watched it this time. Not as a threat, but as a mirror. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult him. She simply drew a line. This is not who I am. This is not what I do. And in doing so, she'd exposed his own lack of boundaries, not with power, but with basic decency. He canceled his next 2 meetings. Instead, he drove to a quiet park downtown and walked for hours, hands in his pockets, thinking. He remembered his early days, working construction, eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch, sleeping in a friend's garage. Back then, he'd promised himself he'd never forget what it felt like to be invisible. Somewhere along the way, he had. Back at Leclerc, the restaurant's owner made a public statement. At first, it was vague. "We value all our employees and guests equally." But after more pressure, they issued a stronger one. "We stand with our team member." Her courage reminded us all of the importance of mutual respect. They also announced mandatory training on dignity in the workplace, starting next month. The staff cheered. For many of them, this was the first time management had ever taken their side over a wealthy guest. But the real turning point came when a major food critic who'd once given Leclerc 5 stars wrote a new piece titled, "The real special at Leclerc isn't on the menu." In it, she praised not the truffle risotto or the wine pairings, but the quiet strength of a server who refused to be erased. "Restaurants like this," she wrote, "only thrive when the people who make them run are treated as essential, not invisible." Reservations, which had dipped after the incident, began to climb again. But this time, people came not just for the food, but for the story, for the feeling that maybe, just maybe, they were supporting something bigger, a place where respect flowed both ways. Still, the man couldn't shake the image of her walking away. Not angry, not broken, just whole, like she carried something he'd lost long ago. One night, alone in his apartment, he typed her name into a search bar, not to dig up dirt, but to understand. He read every interview, every quote. He saw photos of her with her brother at his college orientation. He saw her volunteering at a community kitchen on her day off. He realized she wasn't a symbol or a threat. She was just a person, working hard, loving fiercely, trying to make her corner of the world a little better. And he'd tried to make her feel small. The shame returned, heavier this time. But beneath it, something else stirred, admiration, and a quiet, growing need to make things right, not with money, not with a grand gesture, but with honesty. He didn't know how yet, but he knew he had to try, because for the first time in years, he saw clearly. The real cost of his arrogance wasn't the spilled wine or the dirty shoes. It was the moment he forgot that every person deserves to be seen, and she'd reminded him without shouting, without hate, just by standing tall. Now the question wasn't whether he could fix it. It was whether he was willing to try. A week had passed since the video went viral, and life at Leclerc had settled into a strange new rhythm. The reporters were mostly gone. The crowds had thinned, but something had shifted in the air, like the restaurant itself had taken a deep breath and decided to stand a little taller. She still worked her usual shifts, but now, when she walked through the dining room, guests often looked up and gave her a small nod, not out of pity, but respect. Some even apologized if they accidentally bumped her tray or took too long to decide on dessert. It was subtle, but it mattered. She'd started to believe maybe things could go back to normal, or at least a new kind of normal. Then, one slow Tuesday afternoon he walked in, not with a group, not in a suit. Just him, in a plain button-down shirt and dark slacks, looking more like a man who'd lost sleep than a billionaire used to commanding rooms. He didn't head to the main dining area. Instead, he asked the hostess if he could speak with her, just for a few minutes, and waited quietly by the coat check. When she saw him, her stomach tightened. Old instincts kicked in. Brace yourself, stay polite, don't give him a reason to complain. But he didn't look angry. He looked tired and nervous. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice steady but guarded. He nodded, glancing around to make sure no one was recording. "I know I'm the last person you want to see right now," he said quietly. "But I'd really like to talk. Just 5 minutes. Off the clock, if that's okay." She hesitated. Part of her wanted to say no, to walk away and never look back. But another part, the part that believed people could change even when it was hard, nodded slowly. "My break starts in 10. There's a bench out back." He thanked her and waited. When she joined him behind the restaurant, the city noise faded into a low hum. Pigeons pecked at crumbs near the dumpster. The air smelled like rain and old coffee grounds. He stood as she approached, then sat only when she did. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he took a breath. "I owe you an apology," he said, looking straight ahead, not at her. "Not because the internet told me to. Not because my PR team said it would fix things. But because it's the right thing to do." She stayed quiet, letting him continue. "I treated you like you were invisible," he went on, voice rough. "Like your time, your dignity, your humanity didn't matter next to my convenience. And that wasn't just rude, it was wrong. Deeply wrong." He finally turned to her. His eyes were red-rimmed like he hadn't slept well. "I've spent my whole life building a reputation. Deals closed, buildings named after me, headlines. But none of that means anything if I lose my decency along the way. And that night, I did." She listened, not to judge, but to hear. There was no defensiveness in his voice, no excuses, just regret, raw and real. "I watched your interviews," he said. "You never called me names. You never asked for money. You just said you wanted to be treated like a person, and that hit me harder than any lawsuit ever could." She nodded slowly. "I didn't do it to hurt you," she said softly. "I just couldn't pretend that what you asked was okay. Not for me and not for the people who come after me." He swallowed hard. "I get that now." Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. She tensed, thinking it was a check, some grand gesture to buy forgiveness. But he didn't hand it to her. "This isn't for you," he said gently. "It's for your brother. I heard about school. I know how much that means to both of you." She stared at the envelope. "You don't have to do that. I know," he said. "But I want to. Not as payment, as a promise to do better." Inside was a letter confirming a $50,000 donation to a scholarship fund set up in her brother's name, with a note that more would follow if he stayed in school. No strings, no publicity, just support. Tears welled in her eyes, not because of the money, but because he'd listened. He'd paid attention to what mattered to her, not what would make him look good. "Thank you," she said, voice thick. That means a lot." He nodded, then stood. "I won't take more of your time. But I needed you to know I see you now. Really see you." As he turned to leave, she called out softly. "Wait." He stopped. "Would you like a cup of coffee?" "On the house. Just coffee. No shoes involved." A small, surprised smile touched his lips. "I'd like that." Back inside, away from prying eyes, they sat at a quiet corner table. No cameras. No audience. Just two people sharing a quiet moment over 2 mugs of black coffee. He asked about her brother, what he studied, what he dreamed of. She asked hesitantly what made him change his mind. "I realized," he said, stirring his coffee slowly, "that power isn't about making people obey you. It's about using what you have to lift others up. I forgot that. You reminded me. They didn't become friends that day. They didn't hug or exchange numbers. But something real passed between them. A bridge built not on wealth or status, but on humility and honesty. When he left, he didn't tip. He didn't need to. The gesture had already been made." Later that night, as she walked home under the streetlights, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. Not because she'd won, but because she'd been heard. And because someone who once tried to erase her had chosen instead to see her. The next morning, News broke that the man had announced a new initiative at his company, a foundation focused on fair wages, anti-bias training, and support for service workers pursuing education. In his statement, he wrote, "Real success isn't measured in profit, but in how we treat those who help us succeed." People online debated whether it was genuine or just damage control. But she didn't care. She'd seen the look in his eyes. She'd heard the tremor in his voice. And she knew, sometimes change starts with a single moment of courage and a single moment of humility. She kept working at Leclerc. But now, when she walked through the dining room, she didn't just carry trays. She carried hope. The kind that says you matter. Your voice matters. And sometimes standing your ground can change more than just your own life. 6 months later, the city felt different. Not because everything had changed, but because something small had taken root and begun to grow. The story that started with a spilled glass of wine and a pair of dirty shoes had quietly woven itself into the fabric of everyday life in ways no one expected. She still worked at Leclerc, but not as a server anymore. After finishing her hospitality management courses, paid for in part by the scholarship fund he'd set up, she'd been promoted to assistant floor manager. She helped train new staff not just on wine pairings or plating techniques, but on something deeper. How to hold your head high, how to speak up with kindness, how to recognize your own worth even when the world tries to convince you otherwise. The restaurant itself had changed too. There were posters in the break room about respectful communication, monthly team talks about workplace dignity, and a suggestion box that management actually read and acted on. Her brother was thriving in college, studying engineering, and had even started tutoring other students on campus. Every time he called, his voice was full of that quiet confidence that comes from knowing someone believes in you. And every time she heard it, she remembered that night. The fear, the napkin on the table, the choice to say no with grace, and felt a quiet pride. Not because she'd become famous, but because she'd stayed true to herself when it mattered most. As for the man who once demanded she clean his shoes, he'd disappeared from the headlines but not from the work. His foundation had already funded training programs in over a dozen cities, partnered with community colleges to offer scholarships for service workers, and implemented company-wide policies that required leadership to undergo regular bias awareness workshops. He didn't give many interviews. When he did, he never made himself the hero of the story. "I was the problem," he said once simply, "and I'm still learning how to be part of the solution." They didn't talk often, but they stayed in touch. A text here and there, a coffee every few months, always in a quiet corner, never for show. There was no fanfare, no staged photos. Just two people who'd crossed paths in a moment of tension and chose afterward to build something better from it. One Saturday morning in early spring, she stood at the front of a community center downtown, not in a uniform but in a simple dress and flats. A small crowd had gathered, neighbors, students, restaurant workers, even a few local business owners. She'd been asked to speak at an event hosted by a nonprofit that supported frontline workers pursuing education. She hadn't wanted to at first. Public speaking made her nervous. But then she remembered how much one small act of courage had meant. Not just to her, but to strangers who'd written to say, "You gave me the strength to speak up at my job." So she said yes. She stepped up to the mic, took a breath, and looked out at the faces, not as an audience, but as people who understood struggle, resilience, and quiet dignity. "I'm not here because I did something extraordinary," she began, voice calm but warm. "I'm here because I chose to do something ordinary, something most of us know deep down is right. I chose to believe that I deserved respect just like anyone else. Not because of what I wear, where I work, or how much money I make, but because I'm human." She paused, letting the words settle. That night at the restaurant, I could have cleaned his shoes. It would have taken 30 seconds, but it would have cost me something I couldn't get back: my self-respect. And once you give that away, it's hard to find again. A few people nodded. Others wiped their eyes. "But here's what I learned after that night," she continued. "Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. It's saying no when everyone expects you to say yes. It's walking away with your head high when you're told to shrink yourself. And sometimes, just sometimes, that quiet courage doesn't just change your life. It changes someone else's too." She glanced toward the back of the room where he stood near the door, hands in his pockets, listening like any other guest. He gave her a small, respectful nod. She smiled back, just a flicker, and kept going. Since then, I've met so many people who've stood up in their own way. A cashier who refused to be yelled at, a janitor who asked for safer working conditions, a delivery driver who spoke up when he was treated like he didn't matter. None of them wanted fame. They just wanted to be seen. She wrapped up a few minutes later, not with a grand finale, but with a simple truth. You don't need permission to be worthy. You already are. Afterward, people came up to thank her, some with tears, some with firm handshakes, others just with a quiet "me too." A young woman working part-time at a diner told her, "I'm signing up for night classes next week. Because of you." That hit her harder than any viral video ever had. Later, as she walked home under soft spring sunlight, she passed a coffee shop where a server was calmly explaining to a frustrated customer that mistakes happen, but yelling wouldn't fix them. The customer huffed, but the server stayed kind and firm. She smiled to herself. Maybe that server had seen the video, maybe not, but the ripple was there, whether anyone noticed or not. Back at her apartment, she opened her laptop. Her brother had sent a photo, him in his cap and gown at a mock graduation ceremony, grinning wide. Under it, he'd written, "Next stop, real one. Thanks for never letting me quit." She saved the photo to her desktop, right next to a screenshot of that first news article about the incident. Now months old, but still a reminder. Life wasn't perfect. There were still bad days, tight budgets, moments of doubt, but something fundamental had shifted. Not just in her circumstances, but in how she moved through the world. She walked taller now, not out of pride, but because she knew her value didn't come from someone else's approval. And in a quiet office across town, a man who once thought power meant control, now measured success in second chances, in listening more than speaking, in using his influence not to command, but to lift. Their story never became a movie. There were no billboards or book deals. But in the everyday moments, in classrooms, kitchens, boardrooms, and bus stops, it lived on. Not as a tale of revenge or riches, but as a quiet testament to what happens when one person chooses dignity, and another chooses to learn from it. Because sometimes the most powerful revolutions don't start with a shout. They start with a napkin on a table. And the courage to walk away.